Okay. All right. Well, today we're going to be looking at the fourth at Madeline's, a very pivotal chapter in the relationship between Will, Horton, and Tom. So at this current point in time, they are 4 months into 10th grade. They are exiting the golden years. The golden years being when they had first met in 2nd grade up until the early stages of 9th grade. It was really the entry of high school where the first kind of seeds of division were just kind of starting to come into play. And those seeds of division didn't really come in the form that you usually expect. There weren't bitter arguments, there weren't disagreements. It was just tests and schoolwork, extracurriculars, and anxiety about the future. Unfortunately for most kids, it's never really, a bad fight that breaks up a friendship. It's just a lack of time or the introduction of the fact that you don't have all the time in the world like you thought you did. There was also the individual focuses that they each had, which only increased the division amongst the three of them. For instance, Tom, in his 10th grade year, got into the football team, and that became a huge passion for him. He really found his people with the football team. Of course, Will and Horton were good friends of his. They had been for years up until that point, but the football team sort of gave him that camaraderie that most young men are looking for. It gave him a culture that he could be a part of. It gave him a new group that made him feel as though he was in an army every time he walked into high school. It also led to new social developments for him too. It made him more popular amongst his year. He was quite a big kid, and so he showed promise on the football team, and that promise turned into success, which then garnered him quite a reputation. And the football team in high school is always kind of an avenue for breaking into some of the popular circles. Some of the most influential students in high school belonged to the football team, and so he was able to kind of network on this team and open new doors for himself socially. One of them being that he was the first of his year on the junior football team at this point. He was the first in his year to ever be invited to a senior party. This was at the early stages of 10th grade. As the story goes, when Tom received this invitation, his exact words were, they don't know what's about to hit them. But he did his classic air thrust, and we can only imagine that when he did say this, he kind of said each word between each thrust. If you'd allow me to demonstrate, it would be something along these lines. It'd be, they don't know what's about to hit them. Something like that. That was a classic kind of human minutia, like gesture that was colloquial in those circles, I would say. In the sports-oriented circles of high schools. And then you have Horton. We're going to delve into him in a second, but really the gist of it is that he was studying. He had tutors. There were some great reforms with his parents. His parents really wanted him to focus on his studying. And so they became very strict in the 10th grade. That meant no video games until homework was done, and a strict lights out rule at 10 p.m., which, yes, it did make him a better student, but it really inhibited his progress in terms of his socializing and having a social life in high school. All throughout Horton's life, but more so at this point than any time else in his life, the words of his parents don't ever change. That motto, it had been burned into his mind, and it really showed when he was in high school. He's just coming out of elementary school, top of his class, a great example of a student, won a plethora of awards, and the pressure was on to keep that momentum going. And of course, as you get older, the ability to deliver on those promises just gets harder. And he wanted nothing more than to please his parents, but he couldn't help but feel this urge to do better for himself. And that would prove to give enough ammunition for his interior kind of mental battles for years to come. That would kind of be the main sort of cause of many of his neuralgic battles that he'd have. And then, of course, there's Will. Will is an interesting individual, or was an interesting individual, in that he wasn't much of a changer. He really liked the status quo. He really liked to kind of do the same things over and over. Grade 9 was not much of a difference than 8th grade. He liked to hang out with people for a certain amount of time. He really liked his own alone time. And his routine sort of maintained itself naturally. He would go to school when he had to go to school. He would do his homework when it was necessary. And after he was done his homework, maybe he'd hang out with some people. Or he'd play video games like he usually did. It was only in 10th grade that we kind of saw a renaissance in his approach. He started to look more towards his opportunities at socializing. He wanted to meet new people. More than that, though, he also wanted to take part. He was looking for more things to do, whether this came from a place of boredom or a place of just idleness, feeling like he hasn't accomplished enough at this time. Whatever drove him, he went on to take part in 3 extracurricular groups at the same time, that being the school play, the yearbook, and book club. So he immediately jumped into a very packed semester. But he was enjoying it, and he was enjoying all of the new people that he was meeting as well. So again, if we're just focusing on Horton, school is the main priority. That's where all of his thought is, all of his attention. He needs to get the best grades he can. That is all he is thinking about. His gaming habits and movie nights every week with his family, those remain consistent, even though it does appear as though he is starting to distance himself a little bit from those movie nights. Maybe it's just growing out of a family tradition, or resentment towards his parents. It's a little bit, it might be a mix of the two. And for the most part, he remains with the same group from St. Paul, from elementary school, which is a tendency that most humans have when entering high school. The only difficulty is that most of these groups do break apart. It's only natural when they're introduced to a large pool of strangers. They tend to kind of become nomadic socially and bounce from group to group until they find that kind of cluster of people that they feel most comfortable with. And so 9 times out of 10, students like Horton often find themselves alone because they never took the time to try and find the group they felt most comfortable with. The only explanation for this could also be, or the only other explanation for this could also be that Tom and Will were the only people who he really ever connected with. So there's a split. There is a split. It is unavoidable, really. It's bound to happen with their differing schedules. I mean, Horton, he could hang out sometimes on Mondays and Wednesdays if it was after, or if he got all his homework done, and maybe if it was just before 10 p.m., it didn't really give him a lot of time. Plus, Mondays and Wednesdays, that's when Tom would be practicing with the football team. He preferred weekends. The thing is, weekends was when Horton would be in his tutoring sessions or just sort of resting up after his long, excruciating training sessions. So because of this, their weekly hangouts, their once weekly hangouts, turned into monthly hangouts, where the trio of them were able to get together. But then, after that, beginning here in 10th grade and then leading into the summer vacation, it soon became one-on-ones. They no longer had time to be able to get together, the 3 of them. And so it became more of, 2 of them would hang out while the other took a break. What was interesting about this, though, what's very interesting, is that it was always Horton and Will hanging out, or Tom and Will. It was never Tom and Horton. And there could be, there's a few reasons for that. One of them being a rise in testosterone levels. Usually when, especially in male humans, with the rising of testosterone, there's a feeling of superiority. And Tom who had a much higher testosterone level than Horton, may have seen him as inferior. He may have not respected him as much as he did Will. Especially physically, you know, during their time at St. Paul's, Horton was never an athlete. He had made various attempts at it, failed attempts, I should add, and so that may have just kind of accrued into this sort of resentment held by Tom, which then turned into an air of superiority. Me personally, I really do believe it has more to do with image, though. At this point in time, remember, Tom is a part of the football team. He's got great relationships with members of the football team. And members of the football team, they don't really bode well with Horton and, you know, people who are like Horton. They're not really about the games that he plays. They're not really one for games in general. They're more about, you know, getting out there and you know, making themselves known. They're after an illustrious legacy and, you know, making their time in high school legendary. Trying to make a reputation for themselves. They don't really do well with guys like Horton who just kind of keep to themselves and are quiet and are lame, as they would say. So really, I do think it has to do more with image. Tom was concerned that having Horton around would just kind of mess with his reputation and it would cause him to lose respect in his own friend group. And of course, the same can be said with Horton as well. Horton may have been intimidated by Tom. Horton may not have actually liked the man that Tom was turning into, and that could also be a result of the distance between the two of them. And in terms of image, Horton was a bit of a Puritan. That's an Earth word for not really into. Oh man, that is actually a very difficult word to describe. I haven't had to describe an Earth word in quite some time, but essentially someone who's not really into swearing, someone who is very religious, who is very strict and austere. That would be a good way of describing who Horton was, and Tom was the opposite of that. And so I think Horton was a bit nervous about associating with him. For example, I mean, Tom, like I said, he was one of the first to ever be invited to a senior party, and this was when he was only 15 in the 10th grade. He famously lost his virginity at that party. Of course, it was a hand job from Greta Tiller, who was 3 years his senior at that point. But still, he told everybody about it. He flaunted the story. He took pride in it. And Horton, when it came to sex, he was very distant from that kind of thing. Him and Will both had that in common. And so it's reasons like this that there may have been a bit of a schism in the group. Horton and Tom just didn't agree with each other anymore. They weren't harmonious as they were before. And that left Will. Will seemed to be the anchor that held the group together. Whether that was the case from the beginning of the relationship between the three of them, or if this only just became apparent in high school, it's hard to say. What we do know is that both Horton and Tom had their reasons for having great feelings for Will. For instance, Tom, he trusted him with personal secrets, such as his encounter with Greta Tiller, which he was surprised to be as emotional as he was afterwards. And he shared his feelings and his sentiments about it with Will before he put on this kind of disposition of being proud. He was also inspired by Will's drive and dedication. Someone who like Horton was still good at school, but also able to put himself out there and meet new people. He was still able to. Tom really respected him for that. Tom was someone who could really only do one thing at a time. He was the football team, and that was it. He didn't give a shit about school. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for my language. When I'm talking about human things, I tend to sort of fall back into my human ways. My apologies. I can't even remember where my train of thought was. Yes, he was. He could only focus on one thing at a time. So he'd focus on football. He didn't care about school all that much. Because again, he could really only devote so much of himself to one thing at once. Whereas Will was the opposite. He could do multiple things all at once. And if we're talking about brain activity, Tom's brain activity when he saw Will or thought of Will or talked to Will, the same reactions that happened in here were the same ones that happened when you were speaking to a relative. And considering the checkered relationship and checkered past that he had with his own family, Tom may have seen Will as his only form of blood relation. Even though they weren't blood related, he may have seen him as such and loved him openly. And Horton had his reasons too. Horton had plenty of reasons to take kindly to Will. First of all, of course, when the testosterone levels rose and there was the disagreements between Tom and Horton, there was some tension. Tom would often pick on Horton, whether that be when they were hanging out or if he was picking on him in public to try and kind of boost his aura in his friend group. But Will was always the person who stood up for Horton. He would always tell Tom to ease up, and Will really tried to bridge the gap between the two of them. He really did try and find a way to schedule it so that all of them could get together. He was a great neutralist in that way. He was really trying to benefit both parties, but he just wasn't really able to. Sometimes it's kind of beyond repair, and I think that was the case here. Will also provided comfort in social situations. Horton was very anxious when it came to meeting new people, when it came to, gathering in a large space with a bunch of people around him. The school dances were always a nerve-wracking experience for Horton. But Will was always sort of that rock that he needed. Will, it was a familiar face, and as long as he knew that Will was there, his heart rate kind of lowered and he knew that he was safe. And along that same line, Will sort of served as a vessel for meeting new people, because as long as Horton was with him, he felt more comfortable in his own skin. He was able to put himself out there, meet new people. So he really saw Will as his last opportunity at sort of meeting people and having somewhat of a social life and learning more about strangers and enjoying high school. Will was really his last resort. So he was eager to kind of cling on to that. So, we know the boys. We know them and their current states. Now we need to know about the fourth. Now, the fourth is the setting of this pivotal interaction which will change their friendship forever. This occurred on August 4th, hence the name, the fourth. It became an iconic party, and so from this point on in the high school's history, the 4th was kind of this reserved day. No other party would ever be thrown on August 4th, simply because it can never be topped. It was hosted by none other than Madeline Lewiston, who hosted such events as the New Year's Romp, the football victory parade, and of course, fuck final exams fiesta. I had to put in another swear. In high school, in human high school at least, it was common to detest learning and to hate having to wake up every day and go to school. It was normal to kind of have this negative animosity towards learning, hence the name of such a party. But this would be Madeline Lewiston's last major party before graduating. She was on her leap year here. She's a super senior. So this was her last major gathering before moving on to university. So this was her last hurrah. She wanted it to be good. She had everything planned out, and it was planned out, as you can see from the plans. Each room had a purpose. She took great pride in planning out the rooms so that they each kind of had their own feel and theme to it. The living room, for instance, was the green room, and that is both literal and metaphorical. For those who aren't familiar with Earth history, the color green is, we all know the color green, but on Earth it can have certain connotations, one of them being that it's related to cannabis and the ingestion of THC. So the green room, in this sense, is sort of a play on words, because green room could also mean a meeting space for humans, or in this case, it's a room to indulge in cannabis. And that's exactly what it was used for. The living room would be used primarily for smoking cannabis. There were 2 movies that were set to be played, one of them being The Lorax and the second being Mulan. Had there been a third movie planned, we may have actually... The division between Will, Horton, and Tom may not have been as sharp, but we'll get to that in a few slides. The kitchen was all about supplying. The kitchen was not meant to be a place where you hang out. That was just for the raw materials for the party. So this is where all the alcohol was stored, the ice, the cannabis in question. There was some, allegedly there were some psilocybin mushrooms that were brought by Jake Corriero. And really, yeah, it was just the supplying ground. And then the office the office / the spare room that Madeleine's family kept upstairs, that was to be the rave room or the dance your pants off room. That was where the music was going to be played the loudest, where there was different colored lights, just really give a nice kind of otherworldly appearance to it, and really get everybody bumping, as they'd say. And then, of course, there's the backyard. This would actually be the most populated area, just considering that it was a very hot summer in this particular year, and the backyard was sort of a cool-down zone. There was even an above-ground pool, which nobody was really sure if it was going to be active at this time, considering that when high schoolers become inebriated, my apologies, they tend to destroy what's ever in sight. But Madeleine Lewiston, again, considering that this was her last party, thought that this would just be a mild risk and decided to run with it. So there's a pool in the backyard that people could congregate in, along with the open kind of grassy space to talk and socialize with one another. So now it's time for the party itself. The party, it was scheduled for 8 p.m., but in classic human fashion, nobody ever really shows up until about a half an hour afterwards. For Horton, he overshot the mark a little bit. He showed up around 9 p.m., which was still earlier than Will and Tom, actually. So he arrived between around 8:56, 9:02. Famously, he was not invited. Will and Tom were. Tom was, he was invited first, again, because of his sort of image in the football team. It helped him kind of open the door to this party. And then he then extended the invitation to Tom. But Will was an outsider. Will didn't know anybody really at this party. Of course, he went to class with many of them, but he didn't consider himself a friend of anyone in this house. And that could explain his sort of nervous demeanor entering the space. He knew he wasn't welcome, and he must have assumed that he was minutes away from just being thrown out of the house by a security guard, because his heart rate was just at its all-time high. He was sweating, and he couldn't stay put. He was just moving from room to room. He would go to the bathroom and stay there for 10 minutes, then exit, then go upstairs, and then find a corner to hide in, and then go back downstairs and then repeat the process. It seemed as though he was waiting for Will to arrive, or for something to happen, for himself to get more comfortable somehow. But it was most likely he was waiting for Will. Eventually, he was welcomed to the green room. He was welcomed by Adam Reese, Skylar Serrano, Mahmoud Abiz, and Tori Green. They welcomed him with open arms. Again, with the ingestion of THC, this is common in humans. They become far more loving and accepting than they were when they were not on THC. So, having never known him before, they welcomed him to their ranks. They allowed him to sit on the couch, and they talked for a little bit, all while the Lorax was beginning to play. The Lorax is a very popular movie in human culture, for those who do not know. At a certain point, although he was gaining confidence here in this room, he was making a good first impression, and he was having a good conversation with these individuals. Eventually, they offered him cannabis, which again sent his heart rate skyrocketing once more. Remember, he is a bit of a Puritan. He's not into substances. He barely even drinks alcohol. So cannabis is a whole other ballgame for him. And so he left the green room then at 10:09, which was tragic, considering that he missed Will by just a few seconds. If he had just stayed in the living room and not immediately went upstairs, he would have been in the perfect place to see Will come through the front door. And if that had happened, who knows? Maybe the whole situation that would then occur, would have been different. But anyway, who knows? Will arrived, and he made himself at home. He talked to a few acquaintances. He, kept himself going with a bit of small talk up until he ran into Trisha Holmes. Trisha Holmes was, of course, someone he had developed somewhat of a romantic relationship with, or a semi-romantic relationship with. It was something that he was still unsure of, but he definitely felt like there was a pull towards her, and he wanted to pursue it, even though he had some sort of uncertainties burbling inside of him. After meeting up with Trisha Holmes, she led him to the Rave Room, where most of the students who took part in the school play were. They had just finished a production of Anne of Green Gables, a production that Will actually helped build the set for. So he was right at home. He was with people he already knew. He had a great relationship with them, a great connection. So he was comfortable here. This is where he was meant to be, or at least he felt like it. And he was also completely sober at this point, unlike many of the people, including Trisha at this point in time. On this night, Will was actually practicing a new philosophy of his. He called them the 3 Ds of drinking. And it goes a little something like this. It was, do not drink until you speak to at least 4 people. Driving, don't do it. Drink only in appropriate amounts. Those were his 3 principles when it came to drinking. And this is mainly inspired because, the week before, there was an incident regarding his father and the liquor, which, on Earth it's different from THC. It doesn't necessarily make you more welcoming. It has the potential of making you far more. It has the potential of making you angry and have outbursts, and something of that nature have happened with Will and his father. And it only makes sense that sort of had an impact on him to the point where he didn't want to necessarily jump into drinking. He wanted to see if he could enjoy himself without the drink. So he wanted to see if he could delay his inebriation as long as he could, or if he could just go without it altogether. In this case, there was also a 4th D, and that was to determine whether or not there was potential between them being Will and Trisha. Alcohol can also have the effect of sort of distorting the mind. You might feel infatuation, but once the alcohol wears off, that infatuation might have actually just been a hallucination, for lack of a better word. So he wanted to make sure that before anything happened with him and Trisha, that what he was feeling was true. Like I said, he had many uncertainties. He wasn't actually 100% certain if this was truly affection or if this was just him going along with it. So he wanted to make sure of that first. And so after talking with Trisha and seeing just how intoxicated that she was in this moment, that made him a little bit iffy about the whole situation. He decided to separate himself from the Rave Room and go to the kitchen to find himself a drink. And this was where he finally runs into Will. When he runs into Horton, my apologies. So Will and Horton was already in the kitchen. He was trying to get himself some water. He was trying to figure out the ice machine on the fridge, but couldn't quite get it. And then Will came walking in, and immediately Horton kind of brightened up. He was a lot more comfortable in that moment. But as if it couldn't get any worse, it was like right when the two of them had come together, that's when Tom also came to the party. Allegedly, Will and Horton were about to embrace, they were about to hug, right when Tom came in and sort of interrupted the interaction between them. And he was entering the kitchen with an alcoholic care package. Famously, Tom was always the one trusted with buying the alcohol for parties because he never got ID'd at liquor stores. So for humans, you have to be a certain age to drink alcohol. Of course, many humans don't wait until that age to drink. In this case, Tom was only 15. He was far below the age limit. But because of his genetics and his early kind of high dose of testosterone from puberty, he shot up in height. He was already taller than most kids in his grade, taller than some seniors in his school. He also had some stubble, and he possessed a good knowledge of alcohol already. Most students gave themselves away when they went into liquor stores, going for very strong alcoholic beverages straight out the gate, whereas Tom was more nonchalant with his approach. He would try and get more lighter drinks, as like beers and more common drinks that an avid alcohol enjoyer would get. 6-packs and whatnot, rather than whole bottles of spirits, as we would call them. Anyway, he came in, he interrupted Will and Horton, and he only greeted Will in this interaction, again, just kind of highlighting the separation between him and Horton. The three of them didn't talk for very much. It very awkward, as you could probably guess. They had not been together. This is the first time they'd really been together as a trio in, I don't have the exact time in my head, but it may have been almost a year. Definitely months. The longest period of time they'd ever gone without seeing each other all together in their entire kind of friendship. So it was awkward. They weren't really sure what to do about it. And Tom, not wanting to sit in that awkward moment any longer, decided to take Will by the hand, or not by the hand, by the shoulder, and lead him out the kitchen into the backyard, where the rest of the football team was waiting for him. And from here, we can kind of see that there were two separate parties going on. There was the first kind of signs of a split. Horton now didn't have his anchor anymore. He didn't have Will. And he was forced to sort of wander the party and just find a way to talk to people, to talk to strangers. Now, it was a little bit... This was a good opportunity for him to talk to strangers, and he knew this because with people being inebriated on alcohol, they're not as judgmental. They're far more willing to let things go. They don't always hear things correctly, so you kind of have more wiggle room about the way you carry yourself and the things you say. So Horton wasn't as nervous as he normally would have been, but he was still a little bit agitated. He would end up actually engaging in a conversation with INDVI-HIS for a whopping 45 minutes, which is the longest conversation he's ever had with someone who he had, just met. It was the longest conversation he'd ever had in a first impression. Although calling it a conversation may not be right, because he mostly just listened. He would nod his head and just kind of let Ernie do the talking. Horton was always kind of listed as a great listener. In fact, Will, in a text to Tom, had said this about Horton. He said, "He's a good guy. He's always there. Even if you got to say the same thing over and over again, he'll stay there with you. I don't know. It feels like I should be doing something." IDK means I don't know in human acronym. We sometimes shorten our sentences. So it's clear that Will had a respect for Horton in that regard. He really liked the way that he listened. And also this text is in reference to March 14th, when Horton had his first panic attack and did not come to school, and Will was worried about him, whereas Tom had the impression that he was just doing it for attention. So he was a great listener, so he mainly just walked around the party listening, or attempting to kind of listen to whatever conversations he heard and trying to assert himself, but he didn't have much luck. He mainly just kind of stuck to the same tactic of staying in one spot for a bit and then moving, and just hoping that time passed quickly. Whereas with Will, he was absorbed into the football scrum in the backyard with Tom. And Will was not a big fan of Tom's friends. Now, unlike Horton, Tom was not as concerned about his image when it came to Will. I think that's just because Will was not as outspoken as Horton was. Horton was clearly and openly against the people that Tom was hanging out with, and Tom didn't take too kindly to that. Will was a little bit more reserved. Will would be respectful, as he was in this football scrum. Most of the time when he was talking with Tom's friends, he would do the same thing that Horton did. He would just kind of stand there and listen. And this was something that Tom had actually been made aware of by Dylan Pace. Dylan Pace, who was one of the halfbacks on the team, had actually pulled Tom aside one night and said that he didn't like Will that much because he never said anything. He kind of just, stood there and looked awkward. And Tom actually refused to speak to Dylan again until he apologized to Will, which sort of highlighted the strong bond that the two of them had. But yes, Will was not on great terms with the football team. He wasn't a big fan of them. He didn't have as good of a connection with them as Tom did. And that connection was only made worse on this night when news of Will and Tricia was disseminated into the group. It's believed that Tom had actually brought it up. Will was sort of trying not to talk about it because he knew what would happen. Tom, though, had remembered that Tricia Holmes had expressed interest in Will and decided to tell the football team. And, when it comes to high schoolers, especially football high schoolers, sex is one of those, it's like a religion to them. And so they jump on that at any opportunity that they can. So when they heard that Will potentially had the opportunity at it, they started to interrogate him. They started to ask him all kinds of questions about who she was and what she looked like and what he was going to do. And Will didn't take very kindly to this. He was a bit like Horton in that regard too, in the fact that he was, I think I mentioned that before, he was sort of shy when it came to sex. And this could be for a plethora of reasons. He was raised Roman Catholic, another religion on earth. And in that religion, sex is not frowned upon if it's done correctly. It's something that is never really explained to high schoolers, hence the common feeling of guilt surrounding it. But also there was the instance of molestation in Will's childhood, which has sort of made him very closed off when it came to intimate matters. And so that just makes him kind of closed off in this entire interaction, so much so that after they encourage him to seal the deal and do the deed, these are all kind of sayings related to sex, he eventually found a way to separate himself from the football scrum and go back into the house. But he wasn't able to get away entirely. Tom followed him and continued the pressure, again asking more of those questions about Trisha and what he was going to do. And it's one of the first times that we really start to see Will becoming angry in general. Usually when he is frustrated or angry, he just kind of hides it inside, and he doesn't let it kind of boil to the surface. But this is one of the rare times where it really started to, one of the rare times in high school, I should mention. Once he got into his adolescence, it sort of started to take shape. But yes, in high school, he really tried to hide as much of it as he could. Because Will, at this point, he was exhausted. And now he was just being made even more anxious with all of the expectations that were being set by Tom and the football team. He had just finished a shift from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. at Carey's. This was his high school job, his after-school job. And he's feeling attraction for Trisha, but he's still in that area of uncertainty. And he's kind of riddled with this feeling of guilt about whether or not what he's doing is the right thing. And so this paired with the constant questions and the memories of past sexual experiences of trauma, it was not a good combination for him, and it was just heightening his anxiety. And luckily, Madeline Lewiston came in with her speech to the party. She delivered her kind of final last hurrah speech, which distracted Tom and gave Will enough time to get up the stairs and escape and get back to the Rave Room and give him a chance to hopefully calm down. But didn't really have that opportunity, unfortunately, because he was immediately thrown into another anxiety-inducing situation. He did return to Trisha, and they continued to talk. Trisha was still inebriated, far more than Will was, which did not help his situation. He did not want to engage in any kind of activity with her, knowing that she was under the influence. It was something that made him, again, it brought him memories of his past, and he was not ready to, he didn't want to do anything of that sort. What's interesting is that upon studying his brain activity, the VTA was inactive, which leads some experts to believe that there wasn't an attraction for Trisha. Now, I can't say I'm an expert on this field, but I have studied Horton, Will, and Tom enough to kind of know that, Will was really hindered by his past, and his past definitely played a role in the way his brain operated. So yes, maybe his VTA was inactive. I'm not trying to dispute that, but what I do think might have happened is he was unable to process this feeling of award and dopamine because he was so focused on his past, and he was so focused on doing the right thing and making sure not to do the wrong thing. It would be a problem that would hinder him all his life, and I don't think it has anything to do with. I don't think he was. I think it has more to do with his past experiences than some experts say it does, and that it wasn't just the way he was wired. I think. I do believe it has more to do with what people had done to him in the past, in the way the choices he had made leading up to this moment, I should say. Anyways, Trisha eventually leads him to Madeline Lewiston's room. Now, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but Madeline Lewiston's room, along with her parents' bedroom, which was right next door, those were off limits. It was restricted space. You were not allowed to be in there even for a second if Madeline wasn't there, especially her parents' room. But she also took pride in her own room. It was her private space. She hated the thought that people could be in there. And so, of course, out of all these rooms, Trisha leads Will into Madeline's room. And it is here that they begin to engage in the first sort of steps towards intercourse. With Will, again, being uncertain, not really sure how to... This would be his first time, so he's unsure of what to do. It's also Trisha's first time. They're both sort of confused, but they're going with it, trying to figure it out as they go along. So his VTA may have been inactive, but his amygdala was being lit up like a firework. He was clearly stressed beyond compare, and he was terrified. It was the same level of activation that one would experience in a major car crash back on Earth. So it was clear that it was something that he was not comfortable with, and that he was scared. But he continued to push himself through. Again, this is all kind of comes down to image. Image becomes a very big principle for Earthlings in high school. The way that others perceive you and the stories they hear about you, and he didn't want this to be a story about how he couldn't carry out a completely normal human function. He was more worried about if people would look down on him for saying such a thing. There's also debate about whether or not Tom or Horton may have been responsible for this fear in him. Tom may have contributed to it with his questions and his interrogation. Horton may have sort of upped the ante with Will, so to speak. They had talked about Trisha previously when they had been hanging out one time, and Horton continued to use the word love when discussing Trisha, saying that you'll fall in love, and hey, if you tell her that you like Rainbow Kitten Surprise, she'll fall in love with you. And love is a very big word for humans, especially at this age. It's the first time that they're realizing that they can experience it, and so it puts Will under this sort of pressure. He's wondering if this is love, and if it is, then maybe he should just push through the fear. It begs the question of whether or not, because of this, maybe he blamed his impetus on Tom or Horton for that reason. If maybe he put the blame on them and for the words and the thoughts that they were putting in his head. It might be a potential reason for the upcoming rift that was about to happen. Meanwhile, Horton remained outside near the side of the house. He had run out of rooms on both the first and second floor to kind of hide out in, and he decided to take a break and head into the backyard. And from the backyard, he ran out of places again, and he made his way to the side of the house where he was completely alone. And he stayed here. Would have been about 11:17 till about 11:26. And he stayed at the side of the house, sort of like this, and they think he was focusing on his breathing, because he was staying very still. There was not much activation in his muscles. He was trying to just relax as much of himself as he could. He was clearly trying to lower his heart rate, which was continuing to climb. He also had a hyperamygdala, as well as a hippocampus, so clearly going through the same kind of feelings of anxiety that Will was. In fact, an interesting fact is that both of their heart rates at this moment synchronized at 112 beats per minute, both Horton and Will, which, in the human world you're never really aware of, but obviously for you can kind of connect the dots with that. After he stayed here for this brief rest, he eventually gained the courage and calmed down enough to re-enter the party. And as he went around the back and entered through the back door again, he was spotted by Tom, who was distracted by Horton's presence. Again, Horton was not invited. Tom knew this, and Tom was weirded out that Horton was here. He had concerns about his presence, considering that Horton had an obsession, a previous obsession with Emily Durst, who was at the party, actually. Horton had had strong feelings for her. It was a relationship that did not work out. And he had showed up at her house multiple times. There were no charges pressed, and there was no action taken. And at this point, Horton had admitted that he had moved on from her, but Tom did not believe him. Tom thought that maybe the reason he showed up to this party was because he wanted to go after Emily again. So he was very wary of this, and he wanted to make sure he could stop this from happening before it did. And so for this reason, he then left the backyard and went into the house to try and find Horton and, again, stop anything from happening before it did. And now we're at the inciting incident. So hold on, everybody. This is when it's going to kind of start to get dicey. An important detail is that the light fixture, this is while Horton was taking his break at the side of the house, the light fixture in the dining room was destroyed by Brady McIntosh. Brady McIntosh, just a quick spiel about him, he was a well-known hockey player from the high school. Anytime he had a stick in his hand, there was bound to be destruction of some kind. You could not trust this man with a stick. He was famous in the Horton League Championship for taking out Leon Beaupre's legs with a swift sort of, I don't know what move you'd call that in your words, but it was like a check with his, or a sweep with his stick. He knocked him flat on his behind, essentially. Broke his tailbone in the process. So he was a menace with a hockey stick. He broke the light fixture, and then there was also a pot of freshly made mac and cheese, which he then also pushed off the table with the same hockey stick, landed in a heap on the floor, created a big mess. He was subsequently kicked out of the party and went home afterwards. With the light broken and mac and cheese on the ground, it was sort of hard to see. And when Horton re-entered, he stepped in the mac and cheese, and he automatically assumed that he had stepped in vomit. It was a common thing to find at house parties, or at least in his mind, he thought that it was. He thought that, wherever there was alcohol, there was drunk people throwing up on the floor, and, you'd have to step around it. Him being a germaphobe immediately went into a panic. He did not want to be standing in this pair of socks that he was wearing anymore. He thought that they were tainted, and he wanted them out. So he immediately took them off, and in a panic, he was trying to find Madeline Lewiston, trying to find out where her laundry room was. He was just going through each and every floor, each and every room, looking for something that could help him in this situation. And unfortunately, he walked right into Madeline Lewiston's room where Tricia Holmes and Will were staying. At this point in time, their passionate make-out is the human word we would use, but they're joining at the lips, essentially. It slowed down, and it was no longer as fiery as it once was. They had slowed down. Tricia was attempting to stimulate an erection in Will with constant kind of friction in the groin area, but nothing was happening. And usually in this case, there's a bit of self-consciousness shared on the other end, a feeling of not being able to instill that feeling in a partner. So now they were both feeling very vulnerable, and now they're both kind of feeling pretty bad about themselves. Will was in the midst of explaining himself. He was trying to say that it was the alcohol he was drinking that was causing it. He used that explanation because it's a common trope in movies. He had heard it many a time, and he assumed that maybe if he used it here, he could salvage what was kind of left between the two of them. But before he could explain, Horton had burst into the room. Tricia did not have her upper half dressed, so she dove behind the bed, yelling in a panic. Will immediately tried to cover her up as best as he could, and Horton left immediately. As soon as he saw the condition they were in, he left, he closed the door, and immediately his face was flushed, and he decided, okay, he has to get out of there. He was done with the party, he wanted to leave, he wanted to go home. Clearly there was no one here to talk to, so he was just going to leave. but it was not going to be easy for him to do that, because at this point in time, Mulan had ended. Now, again, I mentioned this earlier. Had there been a third movie scheduled, we may have been able to skip past this ordeal, which sort of led to the lawn blowout, which was the main rift between the three friends. But Mulan had ended. There was a silence in the living room. The stoners, that's the word we use for humans who smoke cannabis or who ingest THC, but the stoners, one of them being Tori Green, heard the commotion upstairs. And she also began to feel a wave of anxiety. This is potentially due to past experiences on her own, in her own life. But she had a feeling that there was something going on upstairs, and she wanted to investigate. So she went to the staircase, the very base of it, and when Horton came down, she would not let him pass. She had a feeling that he was a part of something nefarious, that he had done something bad. And so she began to interrogate him and ask him all kinds of questions about where he came from, what he was doing, and Horton gave up the information freely. Again, he just wanted to go home, so he was willing to do whatever it took to get her out of the way. So he openly admitted that he ran into Will and Trisha, and that they were in Madeline's room, and that they were engaging in intercourse, or attempting to engage in intercourse, that he saw Trisha naked, or half naked anyways. And he just started divulging all this information, which really turned out to be a mistake because individuals who were standing on either side of the staircase heard this and began to disseminate the information about the party. Soon rumors were spreading. The whole story was kind of taking form amongst the party, and everybody was starting to flock towards the staircase to see what was going on. And the traffic jam on the stairs did not let up. Tori would not get out of Horton's way, no matter what he said. Meanwhile, Trisha had finally gotten her clothes back on. Will had tried to speak to her to keep her there, but she wouldn't listen. She left Madeline's room, went down the stairs, but now she found herself stuck in the same traffic jam. She tried to get Horton to move, but he said he couldn't move because Tori was in his way. Now, Tori was trying to talk to Trisha, trying to check in and see if she's okay. There was a whole cacophony of sound, plus it didn't make it any easier that all of these partygoers are now surrounding them, some of them even taking out their portable devices and taking photos of Trisha, who had missed buttons in certain places, and some of her chest was still being revealed to the rest of the party. It was a very intense situation, and because of that, Trisha, who also just wanted to get out, ended up pushing Horton out of her way. Horton fell into Tori, they both hit the floor. Trisha jumped over them, out the door, and she ran home. She returned the next day to grab her shoes, but she just ran right back to her house from there. For the partygoers, what they saw differed. Some saw the whole thing. Some saw Trisha push Horton, and then Horton into Tori. Others just saw Horton fall into Tori and then hit the ground. So pretty soon, it didn't take long for people to start kind of spreading false information, saying that Horton had actually attacked Trisha, had attacked Tori, and that they had both hit the ground. And news of that information hit Tom, and he was furious. Tori Green was the sister of Rowley, who was also on the football team, and Tom, again, he took his relationships with the football team, he took them very seriously, so an attack against one was an attack against all for him. So when he got to the staircase, he saw Horton, he grabbed at him by the collar of her shirt, and he led him out by force. And around this time, Will was finally descending the staircase. He saw the kerfuffle between Tom and Horton, and he decided to follow him out onto the lawn. And now we have the lawn, and this is one of the most important moments in their relationship. This is what changed their dynamic for the rest of their lives afterwards. They would never be a trio again, all because of this split. As you can see in the diagram, they took the form of an isosceles triangle with Horton at the top vertice. If you can see, Tom and Will are both on the same plane. They are side by side. And they stayed in this formation. They stayed in this isosceles triangle formation from 1209 to 1218. Almost, my apologies, 1209 to 1228. Almost 20 minutes in total. And and they didn't move. They didn't change formation. Nobody took a step forward. No one took a step backward. They stayed in this triangular formation for the entirety of this interaction. So this has led many to believe that Will and Tom were actually on the same wavelength here. That Will had taken Tom's side. I'm going to wait a second to get into that because I still haven't addressed everything on this slide. But keep that in mind. So Horton had a raging hypothalamus, which is very different from the amygdala being flared up. The hypothalamus is all about rage in a human being. So Horton was extremely angry here. And based on the many texts that were circulated among student groups afterwards, it's clear that Horton was in a bit of a screaming match with himself, it seemed. There wasn't really a conversation being had. It was just Horton apparently yelling and screaming about being treated unfairly and times changing and missing the past and all of these different subjects just kind of melting into one. Most of this rage you can only assume is probably directed at Tom, considering the distance that was between the two of them. But Tom had more of an activation of the frontal cortex and the thalamus, which means that he was most likely laughing. Horton was in a state of extreme agitation, of embarrassment and rage, and Tom was essentially laughing in his face. Whereas Will was more inconclusive. It's hard to say, based on his brain scans, what was going through his head and what he was feeling. It was almost as if he wasn't feeling anything at all. And so that's what makes this next discussion very difficult, because it's tough to say whether or not Will did align with Tom. Yes, maybe they stayed side by side, Will and Tom. They stayed side by side in this entire interaction. That doesn't necessarily mean agreement. It could also mean sufferance. Most historians do agree, though. Most historians will agree that Will and Tom did side with each other. They did continue to see each other far more often than Will saw Horton, and most of the time when they did see each other, it was in class. But I'm personally, from the research I've done, I don't know if I would necessarily support that hypothesis. Some evidence to point to Will and Tom sort of becoming closer after this would be that Horton's anger may have thrown Will off. This would be the first time that Horton really unleashed something like that upon them. The first time that he ever yelled at them and cursed at them and said hateful things in their direction. And that could have put Will off. That is, if it was being directed at him as well, which I highly doubt. But, even just hearing it may have caused some great distress and may have been a reason for why he would want to distance himself from Horton afterwards. And then, of course, there was also Tom's influence and theories. Will was not a big fan of the football team. We've already established that. But it was another group. It was another group that he was able to socialize with. It was another sense of community. So losing that may have given him some sort of reason to side with him rather than Horton. And plus, Tom had already had his theories that maybe, Horton was, jealous of Will. Tom had expressed his feelings of concern after the Emily Durst situation. And that may have found home in Will's mind. That may have proven him that may have caused him to kind of side with him rather than Horton as well. He could have also been angry over being interrupted. Although he was having a bad time with Trisha, the moment when they were talking, as he was about to kind of like divulge into his reasoning for not being able to perform, for lack of a better word, that could have been a time for bonding. And so he may have felt angry and frustrated that Horton had interrupted right at that time when there was maybe progress about to be made. Really what I think it comes down to is Will's neutralist tendency. He loved both Horton and Tom. I have no doubt in that. And I think he just wanted to give them both a chance. I think he saw the good in both of them, and that he saw they both had reasons for saying and doing what they did. And he couldn't he couldn't pick a side, so he stayed where he was. That is something that Will did best, is that when he didn't know what decision to make, when he didn't know what direction to move in, he just chose not to move at all. So I think maybe sometimes we can misconstrue that triangle that they're in and take the information that he was in the same spot for that entire interaction and mistake that for alignment. I think really he was just confused. And he didn't know what to do. And Horton may have been embarrassed afterwards. And that could be all it is. At the end of the day, human beings are unpredictable. They are very hard to decipher. It's not easy to find a meaning for their ways. They'll often they'll do the opposite of what they want, and when you ask them why, they can't even give you an answer. These were three men, boys, who were extremely agitated in a new time in their life where they have so much uncertainty. They're meeting new people and they're learning more about themselves. They're indulging in new experiences that are turning out to be far more great, far more harmful, and far more disappointing than they could ever imagine. So sometimes they just do things that don't make sense. And I know that's not a very good explanation. I know that that's not the answer you're hoping for by learning about Will and Horton and Tom, but that's just a reality with humans. They do things that are unexpected. And they do stupid things too. Or they did, I should say. Regardless, I think that's our last slide of the day. It is. This would result in the rift between Tom, Horton, and Will. Their relationship as a trio would essentially dissipate on this evening. The three of them would never hang out as a group ever again. Horton and Tom would still be in contact in the future. There would be apologies exchanged. But they never really shared the same relationship that they did when they were kids. And we're going to get into that next week in the university years. Seeing Will go to his dream school and Tom entering the workforce and Horton going to his university in Japan. There's still a slew of information to divulge in, so thank you for being here today. I know it's a bit of a small class, but I'm hoping I'll see you all there next week. Hopefully maybe some more faces. Hopefully. Thank you.